Well, welcome to the Ministry of Grace Bible study on the book of Revelation. This week we are in chapter 18. Yes. Last week in chapter 17 we learned about the vision of the harlot sitting on the red beast. And if you remember right, the harlot represented the false religion of Daniel's 70th week of the tribulation, but it also represented all false religions throughout history. And last week we were told it was a mystery. Babylon is what the false religion was called. And we saw that the 10 kings underneath the Antichrist came along and destroyed the false religion halfway through the tribulation. So mid-half, the religious Babylon is destroyed. In the very last sentence in last chapter was, "And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth." That seems to be somewhat of a transition statement because it's talking about a different Babylon. Okay? Now, if you look closely at chapter 17 and 18, you'll see, as I said, chapter 17 deals with the religious Babylon. Chapter 18 deals with the political, socio-economic Babylon. This is a different Babylon, and yet it turns out to be a kind of religion in itself. That's why it's it talks about doing harlotry here as well. You'll notice in the destruction of the harlot in the previous chapter, there was no mourning. The 10 kings destroyed her and didn't feel bad at all about it. But if you'll see in this chapter that there is a lot of loud mourning from the political and economic powers of the earth. So this is a different Babylon. All right? Same name. It's also false religion, but this is a socio-economic and political Babylon. So let's start out with verse 1. "After this I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory." Now some people have said, because it's made bright with his glory, this is probably Christ coming down from heaven. The problem is the word another, and that's the word allos. Do you remember what that means? It means another of the same kind. So it's another angel of the same kind as we just saw previously. It also starts out, verse 1, "after this," which tells us that there is a sequence of events. This is different than the other Babylon. So this angel having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. Does that remind you of something else? What? Exactly. In Matthew, when the angel of the Lord came down and announced the birth of the Messiah to the shepherds, his glory shone around and they were so afraid. Verse 2, "And he called out with a mighty voice, 'Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean detestable beast.'" So what's a haunt? The word translated haunt is actually from the Greek word phulake, which means a place where something is held prisoner or is watched over or protected. So this Babylon that we're talking about now ends up becoming a desolate place that has demons, unclean spirits, unclean birds, and unclean and detestable beasts. Not the kind of place that I want to spend my summer vacation. Now, compare John's description of the fall of Babylon with what the prophet Isaiah said. In Isaiah 21:9, he said, "And behold, here come riders, horsemen in pairs. And he answered, 'Fallen, fallen is Babylon, and also the carved images of her God he has shattered to the ground.'" Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Also in Isaiah, in the 14th chapter, he said, I will rise up against them, declares the Lord of hosts, and will cut off from Babylon name and remnant, descendants and posterity, declares the Lord, and I will make it a possession of the hedgehog and pools of water, and I will sweep it with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord of hosts. Also in Isaiah chapter 13, in Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherd will make their flocks lie down there. But wild animals will lie down there, and their houses will be full of howling creatures. There ostriches will dwell, and there wild goats will dance. Hyenas will cry in its towers, and jackals in the pleasant places. Its time is close at hand, and its days will not be prolonged. So, again, it doesn't sound like a very wonderful place to be. Babylon was destroyed by the Medo-Persians, and it was almost totally destroyed. But it is coming back to life today. They're rebuilding it. So this cannot be talking about that previous destruction of Babylon. This must be talking about a future destruction of Babylon. And it'll be so destroyed that nothing will ever live there again except wild animals. And that's what he's saying. Okay, verse 3. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. And the kings of the earth had committed immorality with her. And the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. What is her sexual immorality? Right, idolatry. In last chapter, we learned that the false religion was worshiping things other than God, and therefore God viewed it as a harlot. In the city of Babylon, the political economic system, apparently their God becomes money and power. Therefore, God sees that as harlotry. Notice the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her. The merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. Kind of reminds you of James chapter 5, where James says, Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted. Your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. That sounds like James could be describing this end time, doesn't it? Then I heard another voice from heaven, verse 4. Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues, for her sins are heaped high as heaven. God has remembered her iniquities. Come out of her. Does that sound like a familiar expression? You mentioned Sodom and Gomorrah earlier. What did the angels say to Lot and his family? Yeah, come out, because we're about to destroy this place.
I have a question. Why does he always refer to Babylon as her?
Because this Babylon is committing harlotry, false worship. Therefore, God sees it as a her. In Isaiah, he said this, Depart, depart, go out from there, touch no unclean thing, go out from the midst of her, purify yourselves, you who bear the vessels of the Lord. Same kind of message, right? And in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, he says, Therefore go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing, then I will welcome you. And finally, in 1 John, it says, Do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. God is constantly giving his people the message to come out and separate ourselves from the world, from the things of the world. And we are told that we are to live in the world, but not be of the world, right? This kind of goes along with the message I delivered last Sunday. We're supposed to separate ourselves from those people. In Jeremiah, he said, "Flee from the midst of Babylon. Let everyone save his life. Be not cut off in her punishment. For this is the time of the Lord's vengeance, the repayment he is rendering to her." So several of the prophets predicted that Babylon would be destroyed and that God's people were to come out. Also in this verse, in verse 5, it said, "For her sins are heaped high as heaven." The best texts actually say that her sins have been stuck together as far as heaven. Well, that sounds kind of odd until you consider who is he talking about. Babylon. And what was built in Babylon way back when? A Tower of Babel. That were bricks that were stuck together with mortar, and it was raised up to heaven. Yep. So it says here, "For her sins are stuck together high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities." So verse 6, "Pay her back as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she mixed. As she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning. Since in her heart she says, 'I sit as a queen. I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see.'" This political, socio-economic system is focused on getting rich and getting powerful. And do you remember what the characteristics of the world? John said, "All that is in the world, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life." Okay? Lust of the eyes is desiring to have things. The lust of the flesh is the lust of the flesh, physical pleasures. And pride of life is seeking power and position. And the quote here, "I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see." Those who are rich and in power think that they're impervious, don't they? Nobody can touch them because they have the power. But verse 8 says this, "For this reason her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for mighty is the Lord God who has judged her." So this political, socioeconomic system, this system of the beast, is going to be destroyed in one day. Verse 9, "And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning." Now that word weep means to cry, and it means more than just the shedding of tears. It means every external expression of grief. The word wail literally means to strike or beat one's body. So it means to express great sorrow. So this verse said that the kings of the earth will weep and wail when they see the smoke of her destruction. So you know that the kings of the earth were involved here. It says they will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, "Woe, woe, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come." And then in verse 11 it says, "And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore." So the merchants are just as distraught as the kings were. And why are the merchants so upset? They don't have wares to sell, so their source of money is gone. Right. Here's, it describes their cargo. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth,